Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Atomic Podcast. As you know, we touch on many scientific, technical issues, I should say, topics in the area of artificial intelligence, neuroscience, neurotech, consciousness, and these all end up intersecting. Today, I'm extremely excited and I would say humbled by having Dr. Mark Solms. Dr. Mark Solms is really one of the foremost, if not the foremost, neuroscientists of our time. His pioneer work has been in dreams and understanding the areas of affect and how affect actually drives the way in which both the psyche and the brain is functioning and anticipating. And he's also really fundamental to the way in which we are thinking about, I should say, revising and bringing back psychoanalysis into the neuropsychological, but in the cognitive neuro areas of our lives. So all of that will make sense today in our discussion. And I would love to turn it over to you, Mark, and just give you a warm welcome. Thank you.
Thanks. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Yeah, and I'm gonna sort of jump off the diving board here and just say one of the areas that I'm particularly interested in, I think our audiences would be, is looking at your notion of the unconscious, as you both have, I'll say, researched, but also have conceptualized as an area that, number one, is alive. It does it hold repressed contents? Psychically alive, and secondly, how does it overlap, and I'd say how is it compatible with Carl Friston's notion of the unconscious, which is by and large a much more computational model. And I'm not saying either one of you are less or more computational. I just wanted to open that discussion about the differences in your interpretation of the unconscious.
So I will start by saying something about the unconscious in a broader sense than the psychoanalytical one. And then I will use that as a stepping stone to be able to say what psychoanalysts mean by the unconscious within that broader context, and how I think we can understand within that broader context what they're talking about. So first of all, many of our bodily functions, in fact, the vast bulk of our bodily functions operate unconsciously. And that includes, of course, functions which are regulated by the nervous system. So it's not something spooky or something special, psychologically speaking. Even before we get to anything to do with the mind, we have to recognize that we have reflexes, nervous system reflexes that regulate basic bodily functions like, let's just say, for example, core body temperature or blood pressure or peristalsis or breathing. These things just happen all the time. And they're nervous functions. They're built upon those are slightly more complex. We could still call them reflexes, but we don't because they're slightly more complex. There are instinctual behaviors. So there too, these are entirely unconscious. They in the sense that all creatures show instinctual behaviors. Unless you're willing to say that a millipede is conscious, then presumably these behaviors that all millipedes display are regular. These are unconscious instinctual behaviors. The question then arises: well, why is anything conscious? If all of these operations can go on in the dark, as David Chalmers says, why don't they always go on in the dark? So let me use one of the examples I just gave, namely breathing, because it has the wonderful property of sometimes going on unconsciously and sometimes going on consciously, to address that question. What does the consciousness add? Um, so normally, before I spoke to you about it, yours was going on unconsciously. Now you're paying attention to it. But until you started paying attention to it, it was just, it happens all the time. And um, there's equipment in your brain, in the hypothalamus to be exact, that is measuring your carbon dioxide level and your oxygen level and the balance between the two. And that's what regulates the breathing reflex. You know, oxygen in, carbon dioxide out, oxygen in, carbon dioxide out. And it works perfectly well automatically as long as things are going as expected. Uh, what if suddenly the air becomes filled with carbon dioxide? If you're in a burning building, for example, then your normal breathing reflex will not bring in the expected amount of oxygen in relation to carbon dioxide. There'll be too much carbon dioxide. And so now suddenly you become aware of your need to breathe. It's called suffocation alarm or air hunger or respiratory distress. And I hope it's clear from what I've said why it becomes conscious. It's because things are now uncertain. You can't just rely on an automatized policy, which is what the breathing reflex was. You now need to do something else. You're in an unexpected situation. And if you did not have the feeling, you would behave randomly, or perhaps even with the feeling, you would behave randomly. And some of the people would do the right thing, namely go downstairs. That's where there's going to be more oxygen. But the majority of them would do other things, and they would die. The ones who randomly did the right thing would survive, and so the propensity to go downstairs when in carbon dioxide filled rooms, this will then be passed on because they will reproduce. And then this will slowly become a new reflex, but only over generations. The advantage of feeling is that you can change what you're doing while you're doing it before it is too late. So you don't need to wait over generations. You can change your mind during your own lifetime. You go upstairs and you feel the suffocation alarm is worse. In other words, it feels worse. So you change your mind and you go downstairs, and there you experience relief. That's what feeling is for. And you'll see from what I've just said, it underwrites voluntary action. That's what choice is all about. It being able to choose on the fly whether to stick with your current action policy or change it to another one. And it's a kind of trial and error learning. Learning from experience, I might add, with an emphasis on the word experience. You learnt by feeling, not by dying or not dying. You learnt by feeling without dying. And then if you're ever so unlucky as to be in another burning building, you'll know, go downstairs, because you learnt last time. That's an enormous adaptive advantage. Now, let's say you're a firefighter and you've done this sort of thing many times. You don't actually have to remember consciously, gosh, last time I was in a burning building, I remember going downstairs was the right thing to do, so I'm going to do it again. It just becomes second nature. So in other words, the new policy, the policy you've learned, the acquired policy, becomes automatized like the original reflex was. Now, if I can put that into computational terms, very simple computational terms, you are less uncertain about what to do. That is to say, you are more confident. In other words, there is a higher degree of confidence in that policy. And that, in my opinion, is what defines what is conscious and what is unconscious. A policy that is followed automatically, unconsciously, is a one in which you have high confidence. And conversely, a policy that is followed consciously is a policy that you're unsure about. There's less confidence attaching to that policy, which is what feeling is. Feeling is palpating your confidence. Is this going better? Is this going worse? Um, just to make the link with feeling, if things are turning out as expected, that's good. If uncertainty prevails, that's bad. So that's what feeling is for. It enables us to learn. But as the learning, as what we have learned becomes more and more secure in the sense of you can have greater confidence in the policy, then it becomes automatized. That's why breathing is normally automatized, because you can be very confident that if you just expand your intercostal muscles at the right frequency, your blood gas balance will be just fine. Same with one of the other things I mentioned, blood pressure. There's only two things you can do. If your blood pressure goes up, you slow down your heart rate and you expand your vessels. There's nothing else to be done. So that's a very simple policy. There's no other alternative. So it's always automatic. It's always unconscious. Now, just expand that a little bit and remember, we're talking about tiny examples. Over a lifetime, there's an enormous number of things that you've learned, which you don't need to, revisit. You've learned how to ride a bike, you've learned how to drive a car, you've learned how to play the piano, you've learned how to swing a golf club, etc. All of these things become automatized. They are policies, action policies, which are predicted to return you to your preferred states. And in the cases I'm talking about, not the golf and the playing the piano, but the bodily ones I was talking about, your preferred states are your viable states. So this is how we stay alive. It's by when we're unsure, we feel our way through the problems. Once we have got a reliable solution as to how to deal with this situation, we automatize the policy. Not least because conscious cognition is a very limited resource. And this is empirically demonstrated. But the question arises, why should it be so limited? Well, there are two reasons. The one is that the computational power of having to do all of this palpating of your uncertainty in regard to an enormous number of variables while you're busy trying to do something is enormous. Why use the same amount of computational power with regard to all the other things that you're not uncertain about? So this is why conscious cognition is limited. It's because the brain already uses up 20% of our energy supplies. If everything you did was conscious, your brain would be bigger than your body, and all you would ever be doing is foraging for energy resources. The other reason that it can't all be conscious is because you can't do more than one thing at a time, more or less voluntarily. So there's an action bottleneck, there's an attention bottleneck, and which is to say there's a computational bottleneck. So things have to be prioritized. So everything else has to go on unconsciously, and that's the background as to what we mean by the unconscious. Now to move to the psychoanalytical version of this. What we're doing perforce, because of these principles that I've outlined to you, is we are constantly, over a lifetime, learning from experience and consolidating, that is to say, sort of decanting into unconscious memory systems, the products of what we've learned, and then those predictive policies just run automatically. Now, one of those unconscious predictive systems is called procedural memory. And if you look at any textbook of psychology, which teaches you about these different types of memory systems, underneath procedural memory, it says habits and skills. So who among us has no bad habits? And there you have a big clue, which is that we don't only automatize things which work fantastically. We also seem to automatize a lot of things which are akin to banging our heads against the same brick wall over and over again. These are the kinds of automatized, that is to say, unconscious things that we do that interest psychoanalysts. Why does he or she keep on falling in love with the wrong kind of person, and get themselves into the same kind of pickle over and over again? And the answer to that is twofold. The one is that the declarative memory systems, in other words, the ones that where it's possible to bring the predictions back to the conscious state, where they're relatively uncertain predictions, and so they're up for grabs. And by the way, that process of bringing them back into the conscious state is called reconsolidation. It's, in other words, updating the predictions, revising them. Those memory systems, the declarative ones, the ones that are capable of consciousness, what Freud called the pre-conscious memory systems, they are not online during the first 2 years of your life. So they only mature during the third year of life. And I don't mean, on your third birthday, suddenly, you've got a perfectly functioning declarative memory systems. They gradually come on stream. So that means everything you learned during the first 2 years of your life is perforce unconscious. Just to give you a random example, one of the very important things you learn in the first 2 years of life is who to attach to. Okay, because we are mammals, we can't look after ourselves. All mammals attach. That is to say, they become addicted to somebody who's their caregiver. And it's all well and good if you've got a nice range of choices. Shall I attach to him? Shall I attach to her in childhood? But we're not all so lucky. Some of us are born into households where the choice is between a rock and a hard place. Alcoholic, violent father, a depressed, withdrawn mother, and you sort of look, okay, I'll go for the hard place. And then you have automatized a policy. When I feel in need of love and care and affection and attention, I look for a hard place. That's one of the one of the sources of the unconscious in the psychoanalytic sense of the word. And Freud called that infantile amnesia. I've just described part of what Freud called infantile amnesia. The other way in which these sorts of things happen is even after the declarative systems have come on stream, and you now are able to hold on to memories in a way that you can bring them back to mind and revise them on the basis of ongoing experience. You're still a kid. Children, for all of their good qualities, are a bit ignorant about the ways of the world. They also don't have the physical capacity to deal with their needs in the way that we adults do. They are, in a word, not independent. They are dependent upon others. So, it's a lot harder to learn how to meet your needs. And I'm speaking now of emotional needs, which are no less biological than bodily needs, like the need for safety, the need for attachment, the need to get rid of frustrating impediments that prevent you from getting to the other things that you need. It's learning how to meet these needs and to reconcile them with each other. Like, for example, that attachment need I spoke of. How do I keep her, loving me and attending to me and nurturing me forever and always is the one problem. The other problem is to do with frustrating objects, impeding, prohibiting, preventing sort of objects. The prediction there is hit, kick, bite. Get rid of this bastard. But what if the person who's frustrating you is the same person that you're attached to? I mean, whose mother never frustrated them? So you've got conflicts, and these are really difficult to resolve. So learning how to meet needs is difficult. Learning how to meet needs in relation to other needs is difficult. Learning how to meet your needs in relation to other people's needs is really, really difficult. And so to come to the nub of the matter, there are many problems, emotional problems, in other words, learning how to meet emotional needs that children cannot solve. They can't. They just don't. So what do? Rather than use up that little bit of, remember I told you conscious cognition is a limited resource. What's the point of constantly going over a problem that you cannot solve? So what the child does is puts the problem out of mind. They say it works like this, even though it doesn't work like this. It's the least bad solution the child could come up with. And that is what psychoanalysts call repression, putting things which are overwhelming out of mind. And what Freud called a repressed wish is just a childish prediction, an unrealistic prediction. That it works like this. When I'm in this need state, I do that. Even though it doesn't actually work, it's the best the child could come up with. The problem is, by putting it out of mind, what that means is it no longer is subject to reconsolidation. So we've automatized action policies in childhood when we were not in the best conditions to be able to come up with policies that have now become automatized. And the problem is that we don't even know that we have these policies. Remember what I said about banging your head against the brick wall? That's how it happens. So there's a sort of thing that we do. We don't even know we're doing it. We certainly don't know why we're doing it. All we know is we end up suffering. Things don't go well for us and we feel bad. The crux of a repression is that the feeling is detached from the prediction. So you're left with the feeling, but the prediction just keeps chugging away, not getting updated. So that's what we call the dynamic unconscious or the repressed unconscious or the Freudian unconscious. It's exactly the same place as the rest of the unconscious, the cognitive unconscious. It's just that the repressed predictions are prematurely or illegitimately automatized. That's their difference. Now, I know I'm speaking for a long time. You ask a tiny question and you get an avalanche of an answer. But I do need to add one more point, which is that those non-declarative, that is to say, unconscious memory systems, they are subcortical. They are predominantly the basal ganglia, the cerebellum, and the amygdala, which is actually a sort of an extension of the tail of the caudate nucleus, is sort of part of the basal ganglia. These subcortical memory systems have one thing in common, which is that they are action systems. So when I say these are policies, I mean it literally. They are action policies. They are not, unlike cortical memory systems, they are not images. So the cortex, maps your sensory surfaces. So you have these images, auditory, visual, tactile, and so on images, which you can reactivate and bring back to mind. That's how cortex works. So declarative memory systems you can run movies in your head of what I did last time. That's called episodic memory. Or you can bring up these verbal sort of abstract schemas, of how to play chess or whatever the case may be. And it's available to be thought. The unconscious subcortical memory systems, they don't, we remember those unconscious predictions by enacting them. So we don't remember them by thinking them, we remember them by doing them. And this is rather different, what I've just said, from the old psychoanalytical idea. The old psychoanalytical idea made it seem as if there were unconscious movies going on in your head. They called them unconscious fantasies. But it's not as different as it seems. You must remember that these things that become automatized as action policies once were thoughts. So they are the products of a lot of thought and feeling. But once they're rendered unconscious, that is to say that they're deeply consolidated into these subcortical systems, then they are action programs. So this is crucial for what we do in psychoanalysis. We don't try and get patients to remember, how did you deal with the conflicts you had about your mother when you were two? We see how they handled it because they're doing it with their attachment relationships in the present. That's called transference. Transference is the enactment, the unconscious enactment of these policies that I've been talking about. So there you have it, a big mouthful from me.
You bring up two ideas. One is this beautiful and I'll say comprehensive idea of the unconscious. But I want to ask also, does the non-conscious fit within this as well? And what would constitute the non-conscious versus the unconscious here?
There's no generally agreed upon nomenclature. These things have slightly different meanings for different people. So all that one can do is to make clear what oneself means by these terms. So I like the word non-conscious for bodily processes that were there all along. They were born. You were born with them. In other words, they're not derived from mental functioning. They're non-conscious processes. So something like what I said about peristalsis or blood pressure regulation and so on. I prefer to use the word unconscious for mental processes, processes which once were conscious and now have been rendered unconscious. That's also how psychoanalysts use the word. They mean mental processes. I think they're sufficiently different from each other. Peristalsis and an automatized solution to how to get your mother's attention, they're sufficiently different things to warrant different words. So I use non-conscious for the former and unconscious for the latter. But just so that I'm precise about it, the unconscious, that word can be divided up into sort of subtypes. So some people speak of the unrepressed unconscious, and that's the legitimately automatized action programs, as opposed to the repressed unconscious, which is the illegitimately automatized action programs. In psychoanalysis, there's also all kinds of other technical terms. I mentioned one of them a moment ago, dynamic unconscious. That's the same as to say the repressed unconscious, which they consider to be a subset of a broader category, which they call the descriptive unconscious. So descriptively unconscious includes the whole lot of the unconscious, as opposed to the non-conscious. A subset of it is the dynamic or the repressed unconscious. The other part they call the non-repressed unconscious.
Um, when you talk about psychoanalysis here, that the mental processes is really what a psychoanalyst is in part working with when it comes to the unconscious. And yet I'm hearing you kind of on two different levels. One is that it's actually not just mental, it's embodied. It's you sort of map this out as a doing, an enactment that allows a patient analyst to then access much of what was inaccessible or repressed previously. And so I want to ask this question then. So if indeed the automatized action policies have been repressed, inaccessible, how does psychoanalysis move forward? It's a big question, another big question, when actually the re-embodiment is so important to the therapeutic process, I'll say to the talking cure using Freud's terms, when it's actually not just about talking, it's about embodying a certain experience and then taking that experience further. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. First of all, I want to say a word about embodiment, and then I'll speak about the clinical, technical issue that you focusing on. Um, the way that you've used the word now is the way that it's generally used in cognitive science, that our cognition is embodied in the sense that it's enacted. And that's a fine thing to remind ourselves of, that we're not just thinking Homo sapiens, we're also action systems doing things in the world for very good reasons. And among those very good reasons comes the second meaning of the embodied mind, which is that the whole reason that we have a mind is that it is performing work on behalf of the body in the more visceral sense of the word. Because we are living organisms, we can't just explore all possible states. Let me see what's it like to be, to have my core body temperature 20 degrees higher. Let's see what it's like to have it 20 degrees lower. You can't do that. You'll die. So we have to occupy certain physiological states. Those are our viable bounds. And I'm talking now about this whole process called homeostasis. And so you have a demand made upon your mind to perform work in order to stay alive, like in my example about air hunger. And so that's another way in which the mind is embodied. It is performing work on behalf of the organism, and then the products of that work are enacted. So the enacted part, but also the driven part. The concept that we use in psychoanalysis for the second meaning of the embodied mind is the concept of drive. And Freud defined that concept in a way that's still perfectly serviceable today. He said a drive is a measure of the demand made upon the mind for work by virtue of the connection between the mind and the body. There's a lot packed into that, not least of it, our understanding of why we have a mind at all, what our take is on the mind-body problem, why minds are embodied things, and the kind of work that the mind performs. It's predictive work. It's predictive work of the kind that I described to you earlier. When you don't have a ready-made solution, you have to feel your way through the problem and come up with one, and then you deposit the products of that mental work into your memory systems. Now, to come to your technical and clinical question, you're saying if the mind is embodied in the sense of enacted, then why do you guys have a talking cure? There's not much action going on there. The patient, at least in the classical mise en scène, is lying on a sofa, on a couch, and the analyst is sitting behind, and the patient is doing nothing except for speaking. And the analyst is doing nothing except for listening and speaking, probably in a ratio of 1 to 10 to the amount that the patient is speaking. What is more, it is a rule of psychoanalysis, and this applies to psychoanalytical therapies and many other therapies too, not all of them, mind you. It's called the rule of abstinence. In other words, you may not do anything other than talk. As much as you may want to hug and kiss or slap and kick your analyst, you're not allowed to. You can say, you bastard, I hate you, I want to kick you, but you can't do it. And the analyst likewise is abstinent. The analyst doesn't hug you. The analyst doesn't stroke your head. They just speak to you. And so this is the paradox that you're referring to. So the answer to that, I could say a great deal, but I'm going to try and limit my propensity to say a great deal to say just two things. The one is what you are talking about is not theory or philosophy or any kind of intellectual debate. You're talking about the things that you want to do, that you have done, that have been done to you. So you are describing actions, you're reporting events that were enacted and embodied, and you're talking about them. In other words, you're trying to understand them. You're reactivating the memory systems. Probably many in our audience know this, that imagining something, thinking about it, it uses exactly the same brain structures, as the actual doing of it. So this applies to perceptual and motor cortical structures, the things that you can think, the same structures that you use in the actual action. When you imagine the action, those structures are activated in the same way. So, the whole thing is being lived in the life of the mind. It's being lived in a way that's not being discharged in the form of actual action. So why I'm saying that is, you can convey to your analyst without necessarily knowing that you're doing it. You can convey action policies by saying, in that situation, I did that. And then in that situation, I did that. In that situation, I did that. And when that person made me feel like this, I did that. And the analyst starts seeing a pattern. Okay, so even though you don't see the pattern because you're just describing what you do, they do see the pattern. And also you're doing the same thing with the analyst. So they're seeing, well, he's doing it right now too. So that's all this transference stuff. So transference is the enactment, but you can describe it in words. You don't have to actually do it. And then that leads to the second thing I wanted to say, which has to do with this rule of abstinence. One of the reasons we're able to help our patients, I'm speaking about we analysts now, is that we don't have to live with them. They come to our consulting rooms at an appointed time. They stay for traditionally 50 minutes, and then they leave, and they have to leave. So if you have a person who evokes in you, that you really want to just, scream at them, or you want to just get the hell out of the room, or their uh, endless clinging demandingness, you just can't bear it anymore. If you're an analyst, you notice, gosh, this person's making me feel like this. Um, and that means something. That means they're relating to me in this particular way. They're expecting this kind of thing from me. And you can just think about it and make the patient aware of what you've observed, of what's going on. Rather than, what would happen in normal life is you would just get drawn into the enactment. We call it transference, counter transference enactment, what comes from the analyst. And just in case you think analysts are perfect, which they're not, sometimes they do something unhelpful, but then at least they're able to stop themselves and say, gosh, what's happening here? And then think about it, which is to say, analyze it, try to understand what's going on here. And we can be so tolerant and forbearant and abstinent and so on, precisely because we're not living with the patient. This is not somebody who I have to get my needs met too in relation to them. It's just about their needs because they're only here briefly. So we're able to be kind of tolerant of uh, uh, whatever is coming at us and restrained in terms of our own response to it in order to just see what's going on and convey that understanding to the patient. Precisely because we're not acting, precisely because it's just about words. It's a highly artificial situation. But I don't want to give people the wrong impression about in this respect. I mean, it's a very emotional situation. Although it's all words, they're words about heartfelt things. And the feelings that come up in the session and the feelings that come up between the patient and the analyst are very strong, true, real feelings. I don't want to give the impression that it's all that intellectual and cognitive process.
You bring up so many things, so I just want to try to focus on one, and that is the what is gained and lost, Mark, um, with the I'll say current state of uh, cognitive neuroscience without the contribution of what you just described, the clinical experience, the ability to see patterns, and then being able to capture that in a broader understanding, and which is so much of what your work is, but it comes not only from a rigorous scientific perspective, but it comes from this rather messy process we'll call psychoanalysis in the room. And both the mess and the rigor have been territory that you've been on the frontier of. So my question is, what part of that messiness, if you could articulate, do you feel is and will be a greater contribution to our understanding of the mind?
To answer this question, I need to go a little bit into my own personal history for a moment. Um, my introduction to what later became my field of study and of work um, was when I was little. My older brother suffered a brain injury. He fell from quite a height, 3 stories, onto concrete pavement below, fractured his skull, sustained a intracerebral hemorrhage, and was rushed off by, I was going to say helicopter, by aeroplane, because we were far away from the city. And he came back some weeks later wearing a helmet. But in other ways, he looked exactly the same. I mean, apart from the fact that he had a helmet, this is my brother. He's back. Um, but the problem was he wasn't my brother anymore. He was a different guy. His whole personality had changed. His intellect had changed. It was truly uncanny. I don't know. uncanny is that there's a German word that I'm thinking, which is unheimlich. Uncanny doesn't quite do justice to what I'm talking. It's like eerie, like what the hell is, how can this? Who's this guy, and where is my brother? And how come he's occupying my brother's body now? That sort of feeling. And you must remember, I was 4 going on 5 when this happened. So that was my introduction to the fact that the mind is embodied, that we are our brains, that the person of my brother is somehow bound up with this organ in his skull, which means the same applies to me. If my brother can change from one person to another on the basis of this accident, then, if I were the one who was so unfortunate as to have had that fall, I would have now be a different person. And that led me down all sorts of rabbit holes. I mean, I became quite depressed, to be honest with you. I thought I was confronted with the fact of mortality a little too soon. I realized, gosh, if I am my body and my brain, I've seen what happens, in the case of birds and pets and so on, to the body when you die. It's kind of it's gone. So is the same. I mean, it's sort of like disintegrates. Does the same happen to me, to my being, to my experiencing self? And clearly, yes, it must do. Um, and that led me to, if I am my brain, I concluded, and I only have this, I'm only going to exist as long as my body does, then what's the point of doing anything? That was the feeling I had. Because whatever you do, it's going to come to naught. Whatever you do, you're going to disappear, and there is nothing you can do about it. Um, so that led me to a thought, not at age 5, but this was a thought that haunted me. By the time I was a teenager, I had I mean, I suffered really from death anxiety, terrible death anxiety, and I came to this idea in my teens that if all we have is this brief period of biological existence, of sentient being, uh, then the one thing that is worth, perhaps the only thing that's worth doing at all, is to try and understand what sentient being is. Uh, you know, um, this is it. I've got it now. Let me try and really properly immerse myself in this. What is this? It's so precious. Why? What is it made of? How come it's connected to my brain? And I have to confess, I had a secret wish. Um, if I can really understand how sentient being comes about, then maybe I can get some kind of control over mine and prevent it from having to disappear, with the end of my biological existence. And so that is what led me to study that branch of brain science, which seemed the obvious one to study, which was called neuropsychology. And I can't tell you what a disappointment it was. I'm talking about the early 1980s. Um, I thought I'm going to learn, this is the science that addresses this question, this profound question of where does sentient being come from? How does it relate to the body? And, you can imagine what happened. I very quickly got this kind of enthusiasm, this naive um, approach to the problem, which when I say naive, I mean I'm proud of it, proud of the naivety. I think these are precisely the questions that we should be tackling. But my professors told me, don't ask questions like that, and it's bad for your career. And these are not scientific questions, and so on. I mean, this is literally what was said to me. We don't talk about that sort of thing. And so I learned this desiccated kind of, I mean, I learned how the brain works and how it works in relation to mental functions, like visual information processing and language and memory and all of that. But nowhere did anybody tell me why you actually experience your memories, and why is vision conscious, which eventually became this whole hard problem of David Chalmers. I'm talking about the early 80s, as I say. Why doesn't all this visual information processing go on in the dark? Why do you need to experience visual qualia? What's it for? And much bigger questions about, and the self and feeling and all of this, and how does it relate to the brain? How do my being, relate to my biology? So the out of desperation, I decided to train as a psychoanalyst. I thought, well, for all of its faults, and there are other things I could tell you about why I trained as a psychoanalyst. One of them also being that I was still suffering from death anxiety. I wanted to get treated. This is not just a theoretical question about mortality. It's like, geez, it's really terrifying. Um, and so I trained as a psychoanalyst, and for all of its faults, psychoanalysis, it takes as its starting point the actual experiential lived life of the mind, and it's trying to understand that. And that's why I did that. That made me a clinician in the messy world that you were talking about, but I didn't forget everything that I'd learned in the neurosciences. So I wanted to bring what psychoanalysis had to offer to the neurosciences. In other words, this subjective perspective. If you don't take account of the fact that the brain, that there's something it's like to be a brain, presumably for some good reason, you'll never understand how it works. If you leave all of that out of account, you're going to go badly wrong. Because I know from my own experience, as no doubt does everyone, what I feel has everything to do with what I do. And if you leave the feelings out of account, you're not going to understand why I'm doing what I'm doing. And that, and you can generalize that to the whole of the science of the brain. So I thought that we could bring the subjective perspective with the conceptual armamentarium of psychoanalysis into neuroscience, but psychoanalysis, lacked precision and methodological rigor and experimental paradigms are unheard of in psychoanalysis. So there was the possibility of bringing neuroscientific tools to bear on psychoanalysis, of being able to test some of its theoretical propositions and adjust them in the light of the findings, and in this way enhance both disciplines. So that's part of the answer, but I need to say something more, which is that, remember, it started with my brother, and my brother was a patient. My brother had a particular brain pathology, called traumatic brain injury, and I saw over the years what that meant for him as a person, for my parents, for us as a family. It's a gigantic thing, and so I. Actually, I should have said this. The problem for me as a kid was that whenever I did well at school, it caused my brother pain, and it caused my parents pain too. It's not that they said don't do well, but I was in this cleft stick that I felt the conflict between my guilt about my brother and my own ambitions. The way I resolved those was with the same thing that I spoke of earlier, which was, if I become a neuropsychologist, then I will be able to excel in science, but I will also be able to help people like my brother. So excelling in this field, is good. It's doing something for other people. So I mentioned that at this juncture to make clear that as much as I was a scientist and interested in these scientific and, for that matter, profound philosophical questions, I was also compelled to be a clinician, to work with people. I don't want to emphasize my brother too much. But from him it led to, I was very much aware when I was trained in neuropsychology, we were trained to assess the cognition, assess the patient's language, assess their memory. And I was just like, but geez, this is a person, what does it feel like to be them? And And on that basis, normally we just do acute care stuff. You assess the patient, you make your diagnosis, and they're gone. I was interested in the rehabilitation wards, which normally any self-respecting scientist or even diagnostician, clinician, they avoid rehabilitation like the plague, because it's messy work, and it's time consuming, and you got to get your sleeves right, and you got to get stuck into all of this stuff that you don't have to be aware of if you're just a diagnostician or just acute care clinician. So in the rehab wards, I started seeing what happens to these patients, what kinds of relationships they have with each other, with their families, how their whole status in the world is changed, how things go badly wrong between them and others, and how their lives just fall apart and so on. So my psychoanalytical skills helped me with that also. That I wanted to help these patients. And we have no tools in neuropsychology for helping patients with the actual reality of what's gone wrong with their lives. Their lives have been shattered, and they are all about feelings. It's all about your self-esteem, about your insight into yourself and how others see you, all of these things. So I was simultaneously using those skills to deal with these messy things, and also um, in the process learning scientifically something about, well, these kinds of feelings are associated with this kind of brain lesion, and this kind of defense mechanism is associated with this kind of brain lesion. And so I was also at the same time able to make clinical anatomical correlations and learn something about how the personality is organized in the brain, how our most heartfelt motivations and complex emotions and so on are organized in the brain. In other words, to start having a proper neuropsychology of personhood, of selfhood, of mental being. So yes, I've even lost memory of what I'm saying now in terms of your question. It was about the messiness, and I think that I don't mean to cast aspersions. I really don't, but I think that uh, neuroscientists who have never actually dealt with real patients, um, they can be led very badly astray. They're missing so much of the data that they cannot but make big errors. Um, so I think I hope that people can see from my description of what I've done that it's bloody rewarding, and it's really interesting. And it's rewarding in all sorts of ways, not only in terms of doing a service to your fellow human beings, but also gaining knowledge of an incredibly important and worthwhile kind. So I really implore my colleagues to rather than just think, "Gosh, he's a strange fish," he took an odd route. I think that it's a good way to go, and I recommend it to my colleagues. I think that it will advance both clinical care and science if we can break down this normally uh, quite quite firm barrier between the clinical and the experimental approaches to the brain and mind.
Mark, as I've listened to you and been able to understand not just the concepts clearly, but also your emotional stakes in these concepts, or I should say, your emotional stakes and commitment scientifically to emotion, to feeling itself. I need to ask this question. I actually have two. I need to ask the question, like you talk about the rehabilitation setting. It's a setting, right? You talk about transference and countertransference, some of the pillars of psychoanalysis. So you're talking about between analyst and patient, right? What these bring up, setting and that self and other relationship, is is a dynamic relationship outside of the skull, outside of an individual person. It ends up, forcing me to ask the question. We think about autonomatized, action policies. Is there such a thing as such policies then could be repressed or loaded into more of a social context, that the social becomes a sort of mid ground that we ourselves are either trying to heal or operate or figure out or make choices in? So there is, we've been talking about a very embodied self, or a self that is within a person, right? A consciousness that resides, a seat of consciousness is in a person. But is there something beyond the skull, something beyond the person that gets activated, that the person, it's not embodied, but it's embodied across other consciousness? I just want to ask that, not to go into sort of, I'll say, another messy territory of other types of consciousness. I just wanted to get your sense of how that might operate on the social.
Great. If I may, for a moment, plug a book of mine that's going to be coming out in the States at the end of July, beginning of August. It's come out just now in the United Kingdom, but it's coming out then in the States. It's a book called The Only Cure, and the final chapter, there's leaving out there's an epilogue, but in the final full chapter, I go into exactly this question. So I say that not only to plug my book, but also because I can't possibly do justice, in just a few sentences to the complexities of the issue that you've raised there. And so, it requires the number of words that one puts into book chapters. So I will just pick up on one or two of the things that I go into there in response to what you're asking. The first is to say that, of course, our values come from somewhere. They're not, in other words, I was speaking earlier about goodness and badness, and I was saying, well, being short of oxygen, or there being too much carbon dioxide in your bloodstream, it just is bad. And conversely, relief from that state just is good. This is not something, this is a value, goodness and badness, and it's a value which is felt. Pleasures and unpleasures are the way we experience these values, but those values come ultimately from natural selection. It's good to survive and bad to die. And the way it works in natural selection is good to survive long enough to be able to reproduce, because that's what keeps the species going. So there's a value system in all biology, which is the values that underwrite natural selection. And our own bodily needs are an expression, a realization, an embodiment, if you will, of that principle. So feelings and values are rooted in our biology. And that includes emotional feelings. What I've spoken about quite a bit in this conversation is about attachment bonding. So let me stick with that one. I mean, everybody knows it's bad to remove a child from its caregiver. Everybody knows it's bad to neglect a child. You don't need to learn that. You actually know that in your bones. It's just, everybody knows it's bad that scary things, to frighten somebody is bad, because I know what it feels like to be frightened, to be attacked, to be under threat, and so on. So the values that each of us, our core, most basic values, have everything to do with the brain, the sorts of things that I've been talking to you about. And our ability to empathize with each other arises from the fact that we're all in the same boat. We all have the same brains. And let me just mention in passing, the human brain is not that different from the mammalian brain in general. So the kinds of feelings I've just been talking about, we share them with all mammals. All mammals attach, or even birds attach. They form little couples, and they look after their young, and the young go chip chip chip, not for any old bird, but for their parents, and so on. So these are deep and widespread things. But among those feelings, those emotions that I'm talking about are social emotions. We are mammals, live in groups. And because we live in groups, we have to learn how to get along with each other. It's very important for the species that if mammals live in groups, then what's good for the group is what's good for all the members of that group. And so, in the same old way as what I was saying about natural selection earlier, ways emotional inclinations have evolved which are pro-social. Um, and if you don't learn how to meet those emotional needs, you are unsocial or asocial or antisocial, or you have social anxiety, and so on, because you haven't learned how to master this need, which has to do with how do I meet my needs in relation to the needs of others. And because we have to get on with each other, a crucial part of that emotional need, the one I'm referring to, the most social of all of them, it's got to do with how do I acquire my place in the social group? In other words, how do I get in as opposed to out? Remember when you were a kid, choose me, please. Can I be on the team? Or do they want to be my friend, or do they not want to be my friend? It's about getting into the group, having a group that you can call your own, and that calls you their own, and then also your status within that group. It's a touchy subject, but that says a lot. It's a touchy subject because it's something that touches on all of us. So the need to uh, be in a group and to have some status within that group. There are laws governing all of this that we've learned through the study of how group processes work with other primates and indeed with mammals generally. And those sorts of things, that sort of knowledge is like the best kept secret. Nobody knows about what we've learned about all of this stuff. Um, just to say one obvious thing, if a group, a mammal group is they're always hierarchical. I'm sorry to tell you that. You could, in fact, I could just say, mammals they claim territories. The group claims a territory, and then the higher your status in the hierarchy that forms in the group that's occupying that territory, the greater access you have to the resources of the territory. That's the whole story of human history. Groups claiming territories and forming a hierarchy governing that territory and fighting over who's going to be who in that particular zoo, in terms of that hierarchy, and defending your territory against the other groups. That's the whole of humanity. And so we've learned a great deal about how this works. And one of the things we've learned is that if the hierarchy is too steep, then it's an unviable group. So you can have a bully, who runs the whole show in a dictatorial way, and it works for a while, but it all falls apart in the longer run. It just doesn't work. So there has to be something in it for everybody, not equal, unfortunately. We call it the 60-40 rule. So it's okay if he's dominant 60% of the time, but not more than that. As long as I get 40%, of the airtime, then I'll put up with this guy. But if he wants 90% of the decision-making power, and I only get 10%, then it's not fun for me to interact with this guy anymore. And then eventually, you either say, so the bully's got all the toys, but nobody wants to play with him, or you get rid of the bully, you overthrow him. So, I've only, sorry, just touched on the sorts of things that we can say about the implications for society of the sorts of things that we've learned. And perhaps just to put it all into a nutshell, to come back to the way you asked the question, in other words, to try and address the specifics of the question. Although it's all in our skulls are the skulls of a social species. And so what's in our skulls is to use the technical terminology that we started out with, is a predictive model, of what's in their skulls. So I have to have a model of everyone else's model. And so we are inevitably relational, intersubjective, social creatures. That doesn't mean that it's not all encoded in each of our brains, but each of our brains are certainly not an island.
Mark, this is it's such a pleasure. I can only use the word pleasure to be here with you, but also to hear where we're landing right now. Where we're landing is in this area of prosocial. We're landing in your upcoming book, which will have the opportunity, and I'll call part two, to discuss that. So I think that's a remarkable and a privilege. And I also want to say for our audience that the way in which you have described the urgency of psychoanalysis to neuroscience, I think has been probably the most clear I've ever heard. The contribution, also the future, and how the future might look like if we continue to work. And I keep using this word messiness of the clinical encounter, and how that how Freud, in many respects, was in fact so much ahead of his time. He was mapping out a territory or territories in which the tools weren't quite available. And now you're bringing those tools to bear and making those tools available for science. So all I can say from a heartfelt point of view, thank you. And I know our audience will love it. And I cannot wait for part two.
Well, thank you for those kind words. Very, very nice of you. I've enjoyed our conversation too, and I very much look forward to part two, because in what you've just said already, I mean, these closing remarks of yours, there are things there that I'm sure will be occurring to questions arise in response to that, like, well, but isn't psychoanalysis an extremely costly treatment? And, how can you roll this out on a public healthcare scale, and et cetera, et cetera. And so I really want to talk to you about all those things. The answers are important. I think that we are, as a society, really not coming to grips with the public medicine side of mental health care. We're just not doing what's necessary. And it can't be that everybody goes into psychoanalysis either. But if we learn something from psychoanalysis about how the brain and mind works really, and what psychopathology really is about, which is just basically about not knowing how to meet your emotional needs, and there are other ways of learning how to better meet your emotional needs than full psychoanalysis, and that are certainly better than just taking a pill. I'm sorry to say, you cannot change a life by taking a pill. Pills are important symptomatically, but they don't cure what ails us in our lives.
Mark, thank you. I look forward to
Thank
part
you.
two. Take good care. Thank you.